Welcome back to the Foreign Report, your weekly foreign policy show that gives you the gory details of geopolitics with hopefully some laughs along the way. I am your foreign policy curious host, Seena Ghaznavi. And with us is not Nori Malek in the virtual studio, but a dear friend, Corey Brettschneider, co-host of the... Oh, yeah, go ahead. You can say thanks.
I was going to say thanks so much for having me. I'm so excited. I'm jumping the gun.
No, it's good. I want to tell everyone what you're up to right now. For people that don't know Corey, he's a constitutional law professor at Brown. He's a co-host of a new show, or a show that's been going on for a while now, with John Fugelsang from SiriusXM that we used to do his show. The podcast that you have with John is called The Oath and the Office, and he's also the author of a book that we'll get to later in the show called The Presidents and the People: The 5 Leaders Who Threatened Democracy and the Citizens Who Fought to Defend It. So you've been pretty busy.
Yeah, we have unfortunately not talked for a while, but I'm thrilled to reconnect and a lot going on. You know, we're living in the middle, as we're going to talk about as we get into it, a constitutional crisis. And I think a lot of people are demoralized. I'm feeling invigorated for reasons also that we could talk about, but there's a lot to do. A lot to call out, and I don't know why, but I'm feeling a lot of energy.
Yeah, what is that? Did you drink a Celsius? I had a Celsius before this, so that's why I'm a little jacked up.
Espresso, and a lot of. I think, frankly, I've spent my entire adult life in a way, without knowing it, preparing for this, because what I've always been interested in is democracy and its vulnerability and ways of protecting it through courts and constitutions, and also the danger of dictatorship. And wow, here it is. We're living through it. So
wow,
this is the moment.
Everything you've wanted has come true. If you wish it shall be,
prepare
Corey.
for. It is,
Be careful what you wish for.
Exactly. I mean, it is horrific, and there is nothing that I'm going to say today that will do anything but reinforce the real danger that we're facing. But, I think we've seen this before, both in countries around the world, and I know we'll talk about that. And as I'm also going to stress, we've seen it within the United States too. And the hopeful part, and I'm all about hope these days while telling the truth, is that we've recovered. We've had these crises of democracy throughout American history. The presidency itself has always been a loaded gun, and it is in countries too where they've replicated our own system and created presidential systems. And yet America, its system of constitutional democracy didn't collapse. And there are reasons for that, but that's the hope. The main reason, I should say, and the reason why I'm so energized and doing as much talking as I can, and why we started this podcast 5 weeks ago, The Oath and the Office, is because it really is not going to be courts or some sort of hidden system of checks and balances. It's going to be citizens listening to shows like yours and like ours, and becoming aware of what's happening and fighting back. And so that is, I think, where the energy comes from, and the reason I'm doing so much, including this new podcast.
Before we get into this, what does fighting back look like for you, though? What are the fight back recommendations that you have? And we're going to cover a bunch today, but I just want to, you brought it up, so I just want to talk about it now.
Yeah. I mean, I'll tell you my thesis, which is what this book was about. And it took me a long time to complete, about 6 years of really heavy research. And, I was interested in the beginning about threats to democracy. So part of the book is looking at previous threats throughout American history where presidents like the moment that we're living in now did risk the collapse, not just that they did something bad, but they risked the collapse of the system itself. So, for instance, John Adams prosecutes not just a few, 126 opponents are prosecuted in the Adams administration. And there really is a almost completed shutdown of the opposition party. And
are those journalists?
Mostly journalists, but also a sitting congressman, Matthew Lyons, who's from Vermont and is arrested and runs again from prison and is re-elected. So this is a serious shutdown of democracy, as are the others. And courts, this is the first lesson, are not going to save us, and didn't save us then. In fact, Samuel Chase goes and sits on one of the trials of one of the most important editors prosecuted, Thomas Cooper, and make sure they can't even raise the issue of free speech. And Chase and Adams really are monarchists. They believe that the American system of government, makes the president a kind of, not absolute monarchist, but a kind of constitutional monarch. And so you don't have a right to criticize the president. Now, how did that was dire. American democracy almost never happened. And the reason we get out of it is because citizens fight back, and not with huge subscriptions, by the way, with small numbers of followers and readers. They use their own trials to educate the American public about the right to dissent, the right to free speech. And the way specifically that they prevail, because they do win, is they use the Constitution not as a legal mechanism, but as a political one. They use it as the basis for campaigning against Adams in the election of 1800. And presidents didn't campaign at the time. Jefferson gives like one speech. It doesn't go well. And so the editors step into the void, and they become the, as I call it, democratic constitutional constituency that elects Jefferson, in 1800, replacing Adams. And when Jefferson says we're all Federalists, we're all Republicans, what he's really doing is acknowledging that the editors put him there. We're not going to shut down free speech. Yeah. So my point in the book is there is a specific mechanism, and which is citizens rising up around an idea of democratic restoration and putting their power, galvanizing their power behind a recovery president, as I put it. And Jefferson, really Madison in that cluster. So the book is written in clusters of these series of crises, presidents, and then recovery presidents. So that's my theme. That's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to get Americans to see as much as I can both the threat to democracy that's here and the risk to the system. And, we might not prevail. He might prevail. We might collapse the system in the way that Adams tried. But that there's a way out. And that is why I'm speaking out so much. It's why I started the podcast with John. And, we've got to figure out ways of getting people engaged. And it's not just going to be political theory. And, I know that you went to law school, and we've had a lot of in-depth discussions about law, but not everybody has. So part of the idea of teaming up with a great comedian like John and like you, actually, too, lawyer and comedian, is to get people interested, to see the ridiculousness of what's happening, and to kind of aid in this process of not inevitable recovery, but I'm hopeful that it will happen.
There's a quote from Justice Kennedy in United States v. Alvarez that reminded me of. I pulled some. He said, "The remedy for speech that is false is speech that is true. This is the ordinary course in a free society. The response to the unreasoned is the rational, to the uninformed, the enlightened, to the straight-out lie, the simple truth." Oh, Justice Kennedy, if it were only that easy.
I love it. You said I would love the quote. I do. I'd add something to it, which I think is to your point, which is it isn't that easy. It isn't inevitable. And sometimes defenders of free speech, John Stuart Mill is like this too. They say, you have the false idea, and then the true idea is actually going to win out by battling the false idea, as if it's some kind of mechanism or scientific truth. It's not. It requires agency. There's a great Martin Luther King Jr. quote: "The arc of the universe bends towards justice." Maybe, but you can't just leave it.
But it does a little squiggly. It does a lot of squigglies.
Exactly.
Okay,
and not without us bending it. That's the
point.
Is it's agents. It's the people listening to this. To people getting engaged and becoming aware of what's happening. We're going through a moment of despair. I think people are in shell shock seeing how serious this is. But what can come out of that emotion is the galvanization of a democratic constitutional constituency to put democracy back together.
There is a worry as an Iranian-American who I am existentially a product of American foreign policy in a certain way of how I exist in America, really, in the United States. And to think that there was a time when my parents thought, surely the entire country couldn't collapse. Surely the entire thing wouldn't be taken over, taken hostage by religious fascists. But that can happen. These things can happen, democracies. And that was a constitutional monarchy that was corrupted by Western interests, of course, and there was a ton of issues there. So they're not exact matches, of course. You can't really compare the two in any way. I think for me right now, where I sit, at least, this feels like the flavor of authoritarianism that America needs to experience to kind of hit that firing line and see if people are really going to be awake and come to the get out in the streets, frankly. Get out and start protesting, get out and start saying stuff. Have the angry dinner conversation that you're avoiding. Don't be like those guys on Love is Blind and just say, I don't know what's going on. I don't like to get involved. Everyone should have an opinion. You should be informed. Speaking of being informed and having opinions, a student at Columbia had a lot of opinions.
Can I risk interrupting you? Because there's something on that point that I just really love to tag. Two things. One is that I just think what you said is so crucial, so I'm just going to repeat it. The time to protest is now, and the example of Iran shows you that if you wait too long, it might be too late, because just going out into the streets now in Iran is a lot harder than it was
Yeah.
previously. And the other thing I guess I want to do is give a shout out to one of my favorite. You're not supposed to have favorite students, but this is one of my favorite graduate students of all time, named Husbanai, and his book, which I think you would love, and maybe you two could speak to each other at some point, called Hidden Liberalism. That's all about your point. He really looks at the history of Iran and tells the story of its democratic and constitutional underpinnings before the fall. And what it shows, as you pointed out beautifully, is the fragility of democracy, that it really is something that has to be defended. So Husbanai at Indiana University, here's your shout out.
Wow. That was great. I wish I was this. That's great. What a nice. That's very kind of you to say as well. And it is very fragile. And what are we gonna do? But let's get into the meat of the show here. We're gonna come back to this very topic throughout today. I could just talk to you like this, free form the entire time. But I do want to get to what happened over the weekend with the Columbia graduate student Mahmoud Khalil that was taken by ICE officials. And one of the guys in the like crew, his little X-Men crew, was one of the guys that Trump honored at the State of the Union back in his first term. So it's kind of weird that you have like these like marquee ICE officials that are going and snatching people up. Trump had Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, apparently pull this guy's green card. First they thought it was a student visa, then it was a green card, and now he's in an ICE detention facility in Louisiana, away from his 8-month pregnant wife. Okay, no big deal there. And he just finished getting his master's degree in international affairs. I actually want to take a step back on this particular issue, Corey, and just ask you, as a professor, what did you think about the Columbia protests themselves in general? Let's get the culture war aspect out of the way first.
Well, I don't know. I mean, part of what I've been trying to do in talking about this, and maybe you'll think this is a dodge, is to say, and I really believe this, that in a way, I think it's a distraction to think too much about the content of what he was saying, because the issue really isn't whether we agree with what he said. And by the way, it's very unclear what his views were. There are all sorts of accusations out there that he was aligned with Hamas and that he was pro-Hamas, coming from the president in particular, and his so-called truth on Truth Social. And I haven't seen any of that evidence. In fact, I haven't seen anything about what he was actually saying. We know he was a negotiator. We know that he was involved in the protests, certainly. But the reason why I guess I've been hesitant to sort of opine on whether it was good or bad is that I'm worried. I know that the strategy of Trump is to try to make it about that. And it doesn't matter, even if I concede, which again, there's no evidence of this, but say that he was going around saying Hamas is great or something like that. Certainly that's not something that I would approve of or remotely agree with. I think that would be a reprehensible kind of view, celebrating Hamas. There's no evidence that he said anything like that. But imagine that someone did, who was rounded up like this. They still would get protection, because under the First Amendment, even and let's go to a different case. In the Skokie case, for instance, one of my favorite quotes about free speech is from the Blues Brothers, 1980. And of course, they're pulling up in Illinois and they see this Nazi rally. And Bellucci says, Illinois Nazis, I hate Illinois Nazis. Not that I could do it justice. I need a little method acting to get into it. It's just perfectly said. But you might hate Illinois Nazis, and we all should hate Illinois Nazis, but they have a right to speech. And in fact, what he's referring to is the Skokie case, where the Nazis marched in Illinois, and the Supreme Court protected that speech, even with the swastika and its display, even in a Jewish neighborhood, which they were targeting. And so even if someone, Khalil, again, no evidence of this, was saying Hamas is great, that's not a crime. That's protected under the First Amendment. Now, the other argument is, well, he's not a citizen. And my response to that is the First Amendment says nothing about citizenship. It's about a limit on government. And he was here in the country legally. As you said, he was actually a green card holder. He certainly wasn't undocumented. He wasn't a visitor. And he has First Amendment rights. And the court has made that clear, even in the 1940s, when it wasn't so protective of free speech. It said, the First Amendment applies regardless of whether or not you're a citizen if you're in this country. And I think that's the core of the issue here, that it really doesn't matter. Even if he was an extremist, saying things that very few people would agree with, advocating for Hamas, again, no evidence of that. But even if he did, he'd have the First Amendment right. And the fact that he's a green card holder rather than a citizen is really besides the point. Now, there is a statute, and I know we'll get into this, that says, not
well,
a
let me
great
jump in.
Yeah.
Let me jump in there before we get to the statute, because I do want to get to there. But I think what I like is that you got to the conclusion that I wanted us to get to, immediately, but I just wanted to call out, because a lot of times the reason I love this show so much is that we talk about the gray area and the conflicting truths that we have to hold within ourselves, especially when it comes to geopolitical issues. And there's one, what's happening in Gaza and what's happening in the Middle East, what's happening in a lot of these different parts, these war zones and these absolute catastrophes around the world have a lot of this gray area that we have to sit with. And as an Iranian-American, I hate Hamas, right? Yeah. I can sit here and tell you that I hate Hamas. And when I see a kid in Colombia waving a Hamas flag or waving the Islamic Republic of Iran flag, that upsets me, because that's the group that persecuted my family, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, I also know that a decentralized movement in Colombia that is trying to advocate for Palestinian lives is also in the same quad, right? They're in the same green space in Colombia. And both those people exist in the same space. Now, does one advocate for the other? Does one help the other? Is the Venn diagram overlapping in certain areas? Sure. This is a thing that we have to kind of come to grips with. And that's why I love what you said about the First Amendment, is that it doesn't matter the content. The fact that we dislike the content actually makes the stronger case for free speech. It makes a stronger First Amendment case. But I also, to your point, hadn't heard him speak until I heard him get snatched up, right? And so we looked for some clips of him speaking, and I thought, surely the United States, if the president was going to bring down the weight of the national security apparatus onto an individual person within our country, surely this person was going to be a radical, prone to violence, one who was going to want to burn everything down. And then I found this.
This encampment is a minor inconvenience compared to the generational shaping events taking place now in Gaza. Throughout the negotiations, the Shafiq administration treated this movement as a matter of internal student discipline rather than a movement, or rather than as one of the great moral and political questions of this generation. Colombia's short-sighted political decision making today in the face of a genocide that has stolen the lives of over 34,000 human beings, women, men, babies in Gaza, that has destroyed lineages and heritage sites and universities, will be a stain on its legacy forever.
Radical speech from Mahmoud Khalil. This is a normal college student. He wrote his notes down. He wasn't even wearing a keffiyeh. I mean, it's like, he wasn't even, buddy, you could have just played it up a little bit. He didn't even really do much to even signal that he's anywhere close to radical. So I don't see the radicalness in this guy at all. And it was kind of frustrating to see how all that went down.
Yeah, and a couple points. One is, it really isn't about Palestine, Israel, and the conflict in Gaza. Yeah. When it comes to what Trump is doing, he's, and I think you have to understand this case. It's one of the things I've been working very hard to do on the Oath in the Office podcast, is to connect all the dots and to say, what do they go? They claim it's about anti-Semitism. This is the same person, president of the United States, who, when Tiki Torch Nazis marched through Charlottesville, said there were good people on both sides. Now, he has a right to his opinion. He certainly has a entitlement to, and should condemn, any president should condemn bigotry. That was his moment to do it. If he really cared about that, he would. This is somebody who's hosted virulent anti-Semites at the White House. The idea that this is at all really about this issue is false. This is somebody who doesn't like speech that is at odds with what he likes. And I think part of what he's doing here, and what we could talk about too, what's happening more generally at Columbia and the revocation of their federal funds, is trying to shut down the ability to dissent. And for listeners, some people might have listened to what you said and I didn't hear anything that said Hamas is great or anything close to what they're alleging. But they might have heard things in there and said, I don't agree with this or I don't agree with that. But that's not the point. The point is that you don't have the ability as president of the United States to shut down speech that you don't agree with. We talked about the Nazis, the most evil, clearly wrong-headed, to say the least, movement in American history. They have the right to even say they're evil things. So certainly this student that's saying things that you might not agree with, if you're listening to this and you don't agree with what he says, he has the right to do it. And most importantly, none of this is really about the issue that Trump claims. It's about his authoritarianism. It's a hallmark of authoritarians that you want to shut down rights of speech. And that's exactly what he's doing.
Foreign Affairs, I've brought this up on the show before, but the Foreign Affairs put out an essay on this idea of the flavor of authoritarianism we're experiencing right now and calling it competitive authoritarianism, which I find to be really good because they won an election, right? Fair and square, whatever you want to call that, right? And what they do afterwards is how we designed the authoritarianism for our democracy, is that we have all these freedoms, but those also give a lot of room for people that do not want to take the responsibility to care for those freedoms to use them in their favor. You could look at, the Columbia funding is one, and the ABC News defamation lawsuit is another one. A lot of these ways that going after USAID, and, there's a ton, and we've talked about this on the show as well, USAID had a lot of problems, huge issues there at using USAID. But, they just greenlit the 400,000 kids that were going to get peanut butter or something that they had canceled on a whim. So there's a lot of that retaliatoriness that is shown in this way. And it's almost less like, do you think Trump assumed or Marco Rubio assumed that we probably can't deport this guy, but we can arrest him and we can send a message to everyone else?
Well, I think, and I'm going to go deep into this issue. There's a word that I've been trying to that's related to the ideas that you were talking about in the foreign affairs piece, and the word that I've been focused on, which comes from the study of Latin American politics. In the world, a lot of countries follow the Westminster British model, and a lot follow the American presidential model. And the danger of the presidential model is that it's so rigid that it's often, in almost all cases actually, except for the United States and Costa Rica, led to collapse. And the way the collapse often happens is not through some military revolution or something, but through an internal collapse. And the internal collapse is, I think, rightly labeled an auto coup. That's the term in the literature, sometimes self coup, but I like the word auto coup, because what's happening is the president in power knows there are supposed to be limits on what he or she's able to do and just collapses them. So that's what I think you're seeing, that the president, take birthright citizenship before we go to this case. It says plain as day in the Constitution. It couldn't be any cleaner that if you're born in the United States, you're a citizen. So why would they have an executive order that gets rid of that? It's because he's really explicitly, it's not that he doesn't know what it says. He's explicitly trying to challenge the system. They know that Trump's Truth Social post, which we read out on the podcast, actually just says, I'm shutting down the speech of people I don't agree with. It essentially says that. And that's why this guy was seized, arrested, and why we're going to try to deport him. Now, the way the auto coup works is that in addition to challenging explicit parts of the Constitution, you swallow up the power of the other branches. So you're seeing that with Musk and Doge destroying Congress's power of allocation and lawmaking. And you're seeing it in the courts, because what he's really doing is giving them the middle finger over and over again. And even if they stop a couple of these things to try to save face, including birthright citizenship, they're not going to stop all. And I think this time he's gone too far. It's too embarrassing to deport somebody for their viewpoints. But I'm not totally positive about that. I'm positive about what the law is, but I'm not positive that this court is going to uphold the law, because we are in the midst of an attempted auto coup.
Let's talk about that law. And dusted off my very overpriced law degree, and I did some legal research, which I don't have student loans anymore, by the way. I finally paid them off, Corey. I thought you should know.
Last time we spoke, did you still have them?
I did. So the last couple of years, I was able to finally put the nail on them. And let me also say this. I hope everyone gets their student loans forgiven. I want that for everyone. I don't want the pressure that I was in over the last 15 years to be on anyone's shoulders. That was a hellscape. Anyways, the Immigration Naturalization Act of 1952 says the Secretary of State can make someone deportable if they have a reasonable ground to believe that the immigrant's, quote, presence or activities in the United States would have potentially serious adverse foreign policy consequences for the United States. So I looked up how do they define who these are? And so if you look at the definition section of this, they basically define a terrorist, if you will, or someone that's deportable, not just your classic bin Laden terrorist, but someone that is associated with a terrorist group. And so someone that is a, quote, representative over a political, social, or other group that endorses or espouses terrorist activity. So the argument I'm presuming that Rubio and the Secretary of State's office are making here is that because Hamas is designated as a terrorist group by the United States, being part of a protest where you're even handing out or talking about anything related to Hamas could be deemed a deportable person under this law. Tell me, what is the counter argument to that?
I mean, I appreciate the work that you're doing of looking into the statute, and I think there are seriously, it's great. Yeah. There are going to be two ways to argue in court. One way, which I'm hopeful for and interested, is your way, which is to read the law, the statute. I used to teach a class at Fordham Law School called Legislation and Regulation, where this is what we did over and over, like parse the statute, what does it mean? So that's one way, is to use the law as a way of, rather than harming him, to try to defend him. But I think that's not the main argument. The main argument is that in the United States, the First Amendment in the Constitution is above any statute, above any law. And so if I'm right in saying that this is about a shutdown of his expression, and the First Amendment, I'm confident in saying, doesn't just apply to citizens, then it doesn't even matter if they're right about the meaning of the law, if they use the law on their side. Say the court said, okay, that's what the law means. We'll leave it to the president to interpret the law, for instance, is one thing they often say. It doesn't matter. The First Amendment's above that. So yes, they have a statutory argument. It might be right, might be wrong, but it doesn't matter, because in the end, the thing that really matters is the First Amendment right to free speech. And I'm worried about sounding a little gobbledygook. This isn't just any part of the Constitution. To me, it's the core part. It's the right to criticize your leaders. That's not a democracy if you can't do that. So I'm not talking about something boring like we got a lot of different. This is it. You care about living in a democracy, you better care about the First Amendment.
That's true. Very true. And I think the other part. Well, let's play this out. Well, first, they filed a habeas petition for due process, so because they were like, just get him out of here. They were just trying to just completely ship him out, which is crazy. We have murderer felons that get more due process than this master's degree in international affairs student from an Ivy League school got. So that is a issue in and of itself. That's going to happen. I have read that there's a potential that he may just leave as opposed to challenging this on First Amendment grounds. But let's just say he does challenge it, and it is a First Amendment. Does this go right to the Supreme Court? Does this start at a trial court, you think? Or how does that process work?
Yeah, they'll go through it won't go directly to the Supreme Court. There'll be a district court opinion, an appellate opinion, and the Supreme Court can take things on expedited review as fast or as slow as it wants. So it might just want this to get worked out through the courts. There are a lot of factual questions, without any justification, Republicans are saying that somehow he's associated with Hamas. Well, okay, what's your evidence for that? I haven't seen anything like that, and certainly what you played didn't show that. So they might let it play out. But in the end, each court, including the Supreme Court, is charged with doing two things. One is thinking about whether there's the power to deport him under the statute. And then, again, the most important thing to me is what about his First Amendment rights? Because when the president tweets that, essentially, to me, that's almost the basis for the whole case, the president's explanation of why he wants this person deported. And if that's the reason, it's to shut down his free speech. He's admitted it. And that's not allowable under the Constitution. Now, I should say in the travel ban case, which was a case that I was deeply involved in and had an amicus brief that was cited by Sotomayor in the dissent and by the lower courts. I also thought, wow, the president is like way out there. He's saying that this is a Muslim ban. And I think when you and I met, this was one of the first things that we talked about. And I thought, what clear violation of the free exercise clause of the First Amendment and establishment and equal protection kind of go through. He said this is a Muslim, you can't have a Muslim ban. Well, then they rewrote it. They came up with a sort of after the fact justification that was different than the real motivation. Now, the reason it was a horrible decision, I should say, in the travel ban case, Trump versus Hawaii. And one of the things that sort of, made me think the court is not going to be the place that we're going to get our constitutional rights reviewable. But what's different here, and this goes to the point about trying to get him out of the country, is he's in the country. And there's, the rules are much less deferential to a president when we're talking about rights being violated within the country. So I think it is, hopefully he'll stay and fight this. And he's fighting for all of us and doing it.
If you're a green card holder, you get First Amendment protections.
Absolutely.
What protections don't you get?
You don't get the right to vote. You don't get certain rights of citizenship. You don't have the right, I guess, to remain permanently, depending on the agreement of your green card. There are, I have to look. There are not the rights of citizenship, which come with all sorts of political rights, the right to travel under a U.S. passport. And we could go through what the bucket is.
Right, because you don't get that.
But you don't, your rights of due process, your rights of free speech, of religious freedom, and of equal protection under the laws, which explicitly talks about rights of persons.
The main stuff.
Not as that was that whole Civil War thing was about that one. So they're vast, and as they should be. The whole idea after the Civil War of the 14th Amendment is that persons have rights apart from whether or not they're citizens.
Okay, let's take a break. I realize we haven't taken a break yet, which is crazy. Usually we take a break so quick, so we're just like flying over here. Corey Brettschneider, professor. He is author of The Presidents and the People, 5 Leaders Who Threatened Democracy and the Citizens Who Fought to Defend It. He is the co-host of a new show with John Fugelsang called The Oath and the Office. I'm Seena Ghaznavi. We'll be right back after this. All right, welcome back. We're with Corey Brettschneider, the professor. He is the author of The Oath and the Office, and he is also the co-host of a new show with John Fugelsang. Oh, sorry. He's the Oath. That was also a book, The Oath and the Office. That was your first book. It's the name of your podcast with John Fugelsang, and you have a new book out, The Presidents and the People, 5 Leaders Who Threatened Democracy and the Citizens Who Fought to Defend It. We've been talking about the Mahmoud Khalil case and the habeas petition that just went out, the First Amendment issues that are involved here. There's so much happening. We talked about the law. We talked about the issues that are presented here. One thing I wanted to just ask you is that there is this huge immigration rollout right now that's happening, this deportation rollout. Yeah. One of the things I kind of mentioned in the last segment was this is kind of a signal. I think this is kind of part of a rollout that he's doing, a part of like a weird dystopian advertising campaign for his deportation campaign that he's doing.
Yeah.
What do you think about that? Because I still think they didn't, like, this is more of a signal to everyone else that we're going to come after you and to quell speech before it happens, as opposed to one where they actually were threatened by some kid who's a master's student, a graduate.
Yeah, there is, I think, a concerted effort as part of this auto coup to shut down all constitutional rights, including the right to dissent and the right to free speech. And part of the gaslighting is to make people believe that they have zero rights somehow if they're not a citizen. And that's, better way to do that than to just advertise, as Trump did, that he's throwing somebody out of the country for views that he finds he doesn't agree with. Now, there are ways of fighting back, but when it comes to undocumented people, it's harder. And certainly the ICE can, in some circumstances, deport undocumented people. But there are ways to fight back, and one of them actually I profile in The Presidents and the People. The 10th Amendment says that those powers not given to the federal government are reserved to the states. And what happened actually in the Sedition Act is the election was the way that really Adams was defeated and the right to free speech was brought back. But in the meantime, Jefferson and Madison and their allies had this idea, which was, how are you going to arrest people for sedition? Well, you need the cooperation of local government. And they went around telling state officials and passed 2 resolutions in legislatures, but did more than that, saying, do not cooperate with the Adams administration. It's unconstitutional, unconscionable what they're doing. And that's what we're seeing now, too, the existence of sanctuary cities, sanctuary states, the idea of not cooperating with ICE. That's all part of using the 10th Amendment as a strategy to resist this, attempted tyranny, wholesale shutdown of undocumented people and their rights. And there is no way to do this mass deportation without violating people's rights. So, some of it is like this case. I think there is a clear First Amendment issue, and when they're not, there are other kind of mechanisms that can be used too.
This is like what happened with Eric Adams recently as well, where the Trump administration was basically transparently trying to deal make with him.
Oh, wow. I mean, what a case. And, I can't get enough of saying bad things about Eric Adams, but
right?
This is the whole power that we've got in New York to resist federal tyranny. And this corrupt mayor who's made a deal to basically give away our power to resist because he wanted his charges dropped, which he got. It's just the epitome of corruption, and I can't wait until we're rid of him.
Let me pivot a little bit to the economy and how it's impacting kind of the trade policy that we're having right now. Core inflation just came out in February at 3.1%, and I want the audience to really remember that number because that's the lowest since the surge in 2021. I don't know if we're going to hit that low again because the Fed wants to target a 2% inflation and cut rates by almost a point by the end of this year. But that really is all dependent on Trump's economic and trade policies throughout the world. The Wall Street Journal even reported that people in Trump's camp are anxious about the whipsaw trade policies. We've talked about Orrin Cass on this show, the economist, that has talked very extensively about workers' rights. He's a conservative thinker, and he was very pro-tariff. But one of the things I never heard him say was, put on a tariff, take off a tariff. Put on a tariff, take off a tariff. Threaten a tariff, don't do a tariff. This is a tariff? I don't know. I'm going to tariff on Tuesday. I can't tariff on April Fool's Day or no one will believe me. No one believes you in the first place, homie. So, it's crazy. There's a great quote. I mean, if you thought the wedding planners for Love is Blind, by the way, were having a rough time, it's been a horrific, this is a quote, it has been a horrific start for the economic policy team, said Douglas Holtz-Eakin, a former Congressional Budget Office director who now runs the Conservative American Action Forum. Conservatives are scared. You wanted this. You asked for this. And what are your thoughts on how the trade policies are happening right now? I know you're a constitutional scholar, but I know you're tapped into this as well.
I mean, the whole argument for Trump was supposed to be your 401k is going to go up, and look at the market, and he really cares about the market. And if you've been paying any attention to your account or the market, you see how badly it's going. And part of it, I think, is tariffs themselves are, tend to inhibit growth. But it's also that as you said, that even if you were going to defend tariffs, this isn't the way you would do it. It's just a madman theory of negotiation. You see this in his foreign relations. He really does admire this Nixon theory, which Nixon might have had in some of his worst moments. That you scare your opponent into thinking you're a maniac, and then you win the negotiation. And that's what he's doing with tariffs, and it's not working. And countries and the other democracies, their people want to see their leaders standing up to this. And they're terrified and also appalled by what they're seeing. So the idea that we could trust this great negotiator, which is the whole scam that he ran on, I think is being shown to be the lie that it is.
And just to pick up on your auto coup point, one of the things, there's a school of thought from the Trump camp that, he said this in an interview, that China has a 100-year plan, which I've talked about before, that we work on quarters in this country. And Trump said that, which is terrifying, that when you hear Trump say something you've been saying for a while, it's like, oh God, what do I have to look in the mirror? But the broken clock, right? But he said, remember, the government controls everything though in China. That's the difference here. And I'm almost happy he brought up China, because what's clear is that the approach he's taking is the Chinese authoritarian, I'm just going to take control over anything approach. Yeah. And that's how he wants to direct the economy, which again is the flavor of authoritarianism that we're experiencing here in America. How is it, in your opinion, that people aren't flagging that he's making the comparison to China, that we're going to compete with China, but that his approach is the Chinese approach?
I think people, for a long time, it was this sort of owning the libs strategy that he'd say these things and he's just teasing us and it's not really what he believes. But if you listen to what he said, really since he came down that escalator, it is all authoritarianism. It's that he admires dictators, that he's going to be a dictator on day one. And then I think what you're doing is brilliant too, which is linking it to this control over this enormous realm that he can't control, the economy, private economy. And he's not a free market person. Far from it. He's somebody who wants to siphon off. The way to understand this, I think, is to go back. I once asked a really great young politician in Rhode Island, member of the State House, is Rhode Island the most corrupt state? And he said, no. And I was surprised by that. He said, it wants to be, but there's not enough money flowing through. The way that politicians make money, if you're really corrupt, is by siphoning off contracts. Now, that's Trump's way of seeing it. He really is from that New York corrupt way of dealing with the world. He comes out of a New York that had lots of political scandals in the 80s. And, what was going on was the siphoning off of contracts. And that's what Trump is all about. And so it is a kind of control, mafioso approach really to the economy. This isn't somebody who's skilled. I saw a Georgetown business professor, actually, I guess it was referring to Wharton. He was sort of making fun of don't they teach basic economics at Wharton where Trump went? And if they did, obviously the guy who wasn't paying attention, he hasn't picked up anything. And it's all because he sees everything through this really small New York world. It's like a small town corruption, wannabe corruption. And that involves control over the economy as much as he can to make money off it. And you see that with Musk too, that this partnership is all about the fact that Musk gave him so much money. And then, all of a sudden we've got a state-sponsored electric car business when he's out on the tarmac of the White House advocating for buying Tesla. So it's corruption is the deep theme.
Don't even get me started on Teslas. If you want to buy my Tesla, please send us an email, theforeignreportlpn@gmail.com. I thought I was doing a nice thing with the electric. It was before he bought Twitter. I did. It's a family car. Fuck. The tariffs, he's leveling more tariffs. He's saying they're going to come in April 2nd. But if you look at the economic data, and the analysts are saying right now that the tariffs against Canada and Mexico would hit corporate earnings, which is what drives the market ultimately at the end of the day, right? And this could take 2 to 8 percentage points off earnings growth, depending on how real and for how long these tariffs are, and the unpredictability of them is really upsetting people. I mean, watch this space, people. It's going to be insane. I want to take another quick break, and when we come back, I want to dive into your book for the last part of the show. I'm Seena Ghaznavi, Corey Brettschneider. He's the author of The Presidents and the People, 5 Leaders Who Threatened Democracy and the Citizens Who Fought to Defend It, and co-host of the new show with John Fugelsang called The Oath and the Office. We'll be right back after this. Welcome back to the Foreign Report, theforeignreportlpn@gmail.com. If you have a question, send us in. We always are going to have experts and authors on to answer your questions, so feel free to send us a voicemail. Think that you're calling into a live radio show and keep it tight, okay? Or you could just write us in, or you could just put a very mean note in the YouTube comments. We all look at all of these things. But I want to talk about your book a little bit in the context of how it relates to how the world views us.
Yeah.
And so that John Adams thing that you start with is just crazy to me, because I watched that whole fucking show on HBO. I don't remember seeing that. I didn't talk about that. They skipped over that.
There's a reason for it, and it goes to your question, which is that a lot of presidential history and professional presidential historians, who are often not academics, they're people looking to sell books, there's an industry of saying, hey, wasn't this guy great? Wasn't that guy great? And they don't tell the truth of American history, which is much more complicated. And so the fact that McCullough really is the person that the miniseries was based on. I did a live event with Preet Bharara, also it's on his podcast, for the New York Historical Society. And his defense of Adams was like, oh, wasn't it played by Paul Giamatti, and wasn't he a great Adams? And I said, yeah, he played you too on Billions, but it doesn't save the fact that Adams shut down the opposition party. And that's true of, the 5 before Trump that I profile.
Which, by the way, the character in Billions was a much better federal prosecutor than Preet Bharara was, in my opinion. He was way harder on the big banks.
We could disagree. I think Preet did a lot of amazing corruption cases, and certainly far from what we're seeing now. But throughout American history, that's just true, that we have had these moments, and what they reveal, and this is part of how the world should understand us and understand our system, because what we often say to the world is, look at us, we have the greatest system. Actually, we have a system that is deeply fragile. And throughout American history, in addition to Adams, Buchanan, lobbying the Supreme Court to deny Black Americans all rights, Andrew Johnson, trying to bring back slavery under a different name, and Woodrow Wilson, who I say is not the first white supremacist president, certainly, but he is the first white nationalist president, and then Richard Nixon bringing criminality to way beyond Watergate to the White House. What those show is what a warning that was given at the founding by Patrick Henry, who says, do not ratify this Constitution because you're assuming a good person in power. You're assuming George Washington. What if you have a bad person? What if you have a criminal president? And that certainly is true of Trump and Nixon. They're going to collapse the system, that the normal checks and balances of impeachment, of the courts and judicial review, they're not going to stop this person. So my argument in the book is that Patrick Henry's warning is very real, but there has been this mechanism that we started with of citizens fighting back and prevailing on recovery presidents. So the book, as much as it's about presidents, it's about the citizens who fought back. I talked about the editors extensively. Frederick Douglass pushing back against Buchanan and really teaching Lincoln how to read the Constitution, and prevailing on Grant to prosecute more than 1,000 white terrorists. William Monroe Trotter and Ida B. Wells, who push back and call out Wilson's white nationalism and begin a legacy that leads to the pressure from the NAACP on Truman and Johnson to pass the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Now, the end of the book, which brings us to the present, is about Nixon. And I interviewed Daniel Ellsberg before he died and 2 members of the grand jury who tried to indict him. And the story that I tell is that the pardon hid the extent of Nixon's crimes way beyond Watergate, an attempt to kill Daniel Ellsberg on the Capitol steps, the break-in at Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office. You see the theme, a lot of it is about Ellsberg, who was called the main ball. And what you can hear on the tapes from Nixon himself saying, there's information in the Brookings Institution safe that I want that shows my treasonous behavior with the Vietcong to postpone the war until they could get a better deal after I'm elected. I want you to get what's in that safe. And Kissinger says, well, we should go to court. And what does Nixon say back? No, Henry, I want it done on a criminal basis. And I end with Nixon because I don't think we ever recovered from Nixon. In fact, we vindicated a lot of his views with the immunity case, the idea that when the president does it, it's not illegal. That shouldn't be a principle of American democracy. So the theme of the book is crisis and recovery, except for this last moment, which we're still in. We have to recover from the idea that a president is above the law.
I was on a tour years ago in Spain, and my wife and I were vacationing there, and the tour guide said something that's always stuck with me. He said, the American experience is in the consciousness of all people around the world, right? It's in the subconscious, even, if you will, that it's all ever present. How have these moments, can you compare them to how the world views the United States over time?
I love that question, because I think the victories that are won by these citizens aren't just victories in the sort of immediate sense. They really bake into the ether, first of America, and then I'll answer your question, certain fundamental norms of what a democracy requires. So we see on Saturday Night Live every week making fun of the president. The right to dissent was won by those editors. Frederick Douglass talked about not we the white people in the preamble. It says we the people, and he used that to defend an idea of multiracial democracy. And the fight against Nixon that we're still in is about the idea that no person is above the law, not even a president. And I think those American principles of constitutional democracy are also human rights principles. And that's not by accident that the world sort of learn from it. Now, we sometimes talk as if they were learning from the American founders. That's not really who they were learning from. They were learning from these citizens and their interpretation of the system that the American framers created.
Your book is a lot about at least what I saw was that how history kind of rhymes, right? And especially in America. Where else in the world do you see the echoes of the U.S.'s problems?
Well, I think you see it, unfortunately, in the many auto coups that have happened throughout the world where the American system was replicated. When you look at Venezuela at one point in Peru, you can keep going. And the examples in particular in Latin America, which has, almost in all cases followed the American system, you see the collapse that can come from it. Now, one of the things going back in history that is especially frightening is the German Weimar model is a sort of combination of the American presidential system, strong executive, and parliamentary system. But it is the strong executive, of course, that leads to the collapse of the system through the Reichstag fire decree, for instance, and emergency
They bounced
powers.
back quick, though. They bounced
Yeah,
back.
it didn't go so well. So, that's the danger. The threat really is that so much of the collapses, the auto coups, and the Nazi case is a case of an auto coup as well, come from the American idea of the presidency. And so far from McCulloch and this wonderful John Adams, I love Paul Giamatti, don't get me wrong.
Oh, same. Yeah, of course.
But, that's not really the story of America.
I mean, it wasn't Paul's job. It wasn't Paul's job to be like, yeah, he did arrest 126 people. Should we put that in the script? Episode 3,
I think they do. In fairness, they do mention it, but it's like, oh yeah, we're going to put some people in prison. Okay, aren't I learning? Part of it is to go back to the Adams point. I'm glad you're fascinated by him too. He, like a lot of these people, Woodrow Wilson, is extremely learned. He writes these books, of political theory, which is unusual for a president. They're supposed to be great and brilliant. I read them. They're like, okay, they're not great and brilliant. Woodrow Wilson, probably the premier constitutional thinker of his time, professor at Princeton and president of Princeton. I went into his lecture notes. I'm the first person to ever do this to see what is he actually saying in the lecture. And I'll tell you what he's saying. And, I don't think you're going to call it brilliant after you
White
hear
power.
it.
No, he didn't say that.
It's almost that. He says,
oh, God.
Yeah, I'm not kidding. I mean, he says that the point of the president is to follow the German model of efficiency. Bismarck is who he admires. And what's the thing that gets in the way of efficiency? And what he says in the lectures again and again, and in statements, including in an argument with Trotter, where he tried this argument, is what he calls friction. And what is friction? It's integration. And so the white supremacy is baked into the philosophy of his idea of the Constitution. And, I show this not just through the lecture notes. And what I say, this will also, I hope, blow your mind. Everyone has heard that Birth of a Nation, the celebration of the Ku Klux Klan, was shown in the White House. But what's not discussed, and what I show in the book, is that the author of The Klansman, who the movie is based on, what the book the movie is based on, was a friend of Wilson's in graduate school. And what The Klansman does is it takes Wilson's textbook, which was a sort of popular textbook, and really tells that story of the glory of the Klan. And you see that in the book, and I quote from the book. So this was a white nationalist. I mean, that is what he gave us. And going back to Adams, he's not hiding this, and neither is Wilson, really. I mean, what you get in Adams, to go back, is monarchism. And he says, these editors can't criticize me. I'm like a king. I'm immune. That's the idea. So these supposed learned professors and scholars, what they're saying with their scholarship is deeply troubling.
Last question for you. Last question, and then I'll let you go. Thank you so much for your time. Marco
pleasure.
Rubio and these Chinese representatives have all talked about it being in a multipolar world. Post-World War II, it was U.S. and Russia. Then post-Cold War, it's really just been the United States. Now it's multipolar. But we're a much more globalized society now. Do you think this means America is inherently weaker because of that? Or is it we just have new competition for a greater piece of a larger piece of the world's pie, if you will?
Well, I think going back to our earlier discussion about the book, in the same way that the American experience of these citizens demanding democracy really did disseminate into the world and has become part of not just the American consciousness, but the world consciousness, that process can continue. But what's happening instead, I think, is a regression. And what the world is seeing, the world doesn't like. It's a wannabe despot. The world has seen despots like this before, and it's not popular for good reason. It's not in the interest of the world to have a wannabe dictator in the White House. So America could lead with democratic ideals, and I think we've done that in the past. Presidents working together with citizens on these expansive universal ideas. That's the key, as opposed to despotism, which is by definition not universal and which is local in the worst way. And that's why America right now is certainly not a leader.
Corey Brettschneider, professor of constitutional law at Brown. He's the author of The Presidents and the People, 5 Leaders Who Threatened Democracy and the Citizens Who Fought to Defend It, as well as the co-host with John Fugelsang of the show The Oath and the Office. Corey, thanks so much for being on the Foreign Report.
Thank you so much, Seena. I just loved it. I loved our conversations before. And yes, please subscribe to the Oath in the Office podcast and join us there too. And what a pleasure to join you and to reconnect.
All right. Big thanks to Professor Bretschneider there for being on the show. There was so much we covered there. I didn't get to a lot of the news. Some things I wanted to just bring up. Apparently, Ukraine has agreed to a ceasefire deal that was backed by the U.S. You also have to remember, folks, that the break between the United States and Europe, it's happened. It's a wrap. We went from having the American military-industrial complex. Now Europe is going to have their own. Germany has separated its budget from defense, which means like they don't have to really care how much they spend. They can deficit spend for defense. So which means we're going to have an arms race happening in Europe. That means there's a global arms race. It was like everyone's going to have missiles, big missiles now, which is, fantastic. Great. Who doesn't want that? Other thing that happened in the Philippines, Duarte. I don't know if you guys, Philippines ex-president Duarte is heading to the ICC to face charges linked to the war on drugs he was doing. Check out the War on Drugs season, of course, on Fraudsters, but this was an international story that I really wanted to cover. But if I would have covered this mass murderer, Rodrigo Duarte, I think our audience would have broken. So since taking office in 2016, Philippine President Rodrigo Duarte has carried out the war on drugs that led to deaths of over 12,000 Filipinos to date, mostly in urban poor. At least 2,500 of those killings have been attributed to the national police. Human Rights Watch found that the police were falsifying evidence to justify the unlawful killings. Here's a quote to sum what he said up. On the eve of his May 9th, 2016 election victory, Duarte told the crowd of more than 300,000 people, quote, "If I make it to the presidential palace, I will do just what I did as mayor. You drug pushers, hold up men, and do nothings. You better get out because I'll kill you." Oh, he doesn't mean kill him with sweet beets or delicious food. Killing. So, well, great uplifting story there. And then I think we're going to talk about this next week. China circled Australia with warships, with Navy ships. They went through around the entire continent. Something to really watch out for as China gets more aggressive in their part of the world. I mean, that is crazy. And Australia's over here like, can we trust America? What can we do? So something to look out for. All right. That's the show. Woo! Man. Wow, that Celsius coursing through my veins. the4reportlpn@gmail.com. Send us an email. Hit us up on social media. Other than that, thank you, everyone. We'll see you next week.